The UK and Australia are to open preliminary negotiations about a future post-Brexit trade agreement. Australia's Trade Minister Stephen Chiobo, who's in London to meet International Trade Secretary Liam Fox, said officials from the two countries would meet twice a year to discuss the outline of an agreement. But he added that formal negotiations cannot start until the UK leaves the EU and that it would be at least 2.5 years before any deal could be finalised. Well, let's bring in our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, at Westminster. So it's quite a long time frame, isn't it, Norman? Why does it have to be such a long time frame?
Well, because the Australians are saying they can't even begin negotiations until we've actually left the EU. And I suppose the concern has to be that Australia is probably one of the easiest countries for Britain to secure a deal with because they want a deal. We have long established ties with them. And it raises the question, what happens in much more difficult markets? Well, I'm joined by the Lib Dem leader, Mr Farron. Now, you've got an announcement today about Brexit, but just before we talk about that, I mean, maybe 2.5 years actually isn't that bad.
Well, I guess today in the response to the Australian government is something that reminds us again that the promises made by those who led the Leave campaign were bogus. As you say, Australia is one of the easiest countries for us to come up with a deal with. A deal with Australia obviously would be a very, very good thing for our economy, but the Australian government is saying what the American government just said a few days earlier, which is that we'll be behind the European Union in any queue for a new deal, and that will cost us hugely as a country. So far from having taken back control, we seem to be losing control almost by the day.
Now, you are committing the Liberal Democrats today to press for a second referendum on the deal that Mrs May eventually comes up with. But to be honest, isn't it basically a second referendum to scupper the result of the first referendum?
Well, I disagree with, but fully respect the outcome of the referendum on the 23rd of June. I think the direction we now move is towards preparing for Brexit, and we'll be interested to see what that plan is when the Conservative government finally comes up with one. What we're saying, though, is that voting for a departure, which we did on the 23rd of June, is totally different from voting for a destination, which could be in or out of the single market. It could be some level of free movement. It could be some kind of police cooperation. Who knows what that might mean for every single one of us in this country. Very wrong for a government to impose on the British people something they didn't vote for. So we think that they should have the final say. The British people should have their say in a referendum whether we accept the deal or not.
But what happens then if the British people say, well, you know what, we don't like this deal? What happens then?
Well, that would be their right.
And if are we in or are we out?
Well, in that case, I guess the status quo would remain, which is we remain in the European Union, but that means that the British government is all the more held to account to make sure the deal they get is as good for Britain as is humanly possible.
But when we voted to go into the European Union back in the 1970s, we didn't then have a subsequent referendum to decide the terms of our entry into the EU, so why should we have...
Well, in one sense we did, because we already knew what was there, and we were joining the thing that was there, and it's no fault of anybody, however they voted on the 23rd of June, that people did not vote for a particular direction. They weren't offered it. It wasn't on the ballot paper. Do you want to stay in the EU, which was narrowly defeated, or do you want to leave it to some undeclared destination that was not set out? And it seems to me absolutely right, whether you are in the 52% or the 48%, whether you've changed your mind, whether you've stayed the same, it doesn't matter to me. The British people should be sovereign. They should make the decision on this. It should not be imposed upon the British people by a government that has consulted nobody.
Mr Farron, thanks very much for your time. John, I should tell you that the Labour challenger Owen Smith actually is taking a remarkably similar approach. He too is suggesting that there should be a second referendum on any deal that is eventually done.